Morning, Joe. I think you're on mute.
Unmute and it didn't work. Okay.
There you go. There you go. I'm good. Glad you can make it. Is your friend able to make it?
We will find out when we go live. I don't know. I sent him the information.
All
He
right.
did not respond. Sometimes he doesn't respond. So
Okay.
it's a definite maybe.
Well, unfortunately, I planned this probably. I mean, I commit to these dates early just because I want to make sure I get the SABR account. But we are missing that good one, the next Margaret Reardon thing today. Here's Dave Scott. It was on the 54 integration of the 54 Indians.
Oh, okay.
You know, so
I hadn't seen that advertised. You know, there are just so many things
there are
in this world coming at you these days that, at least for me, it's hard to keep up.
Yeah, it is. It is. I stay pretty faithful to the stuff in Ohio, though. I try to make all your stuff over in Toledo with Tom. I try to attend Tom's stuff as well. Dayton hasn't done a lot, or at least not that I'm aware of, hasn't done a lot of virtual stuff. To my knowledge, they haven't done any. But
I like you, I'm signed up for those. I try to pay attention to and reach out and as appropriate connect with. I've also been connected with the Detroit chapter, and they were on the resuscitation path, and then it looks like now they're back in a difficult transition path to an unknown new leader.
Yeah. Hey, David, you're mute.
Hey, man.
Good to see you.
You too. What's going on with you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good.
Well, good.
Hello,
Hi, Dave.
Joe here.
I'm going back on mute.
Okay. Hey, Jim.
Hi, Blake.
I was going to say right now, Jim, we only see the top of your head.
Yeah.
There. Is that
There
better?
you go. That's much better. Thanks.
Hi, Jim.
Or maybe that's better. I don't know. Is that better? How about that? We've got the Cy Young winner from both leagues in the same state.
Yeah. And
Unbelievable.
I'll tell you, I was really rooting for Jose to win the MVP as well.
Yeah, he
Thought he
almost
had
did. Second
I
place.
thought he had. I did not see how many votes he lost by, but it couldn't have been too many.
I think he did not get very many first place votes,
Oh,
but he got a whole
okay.
bunch of second place votes. So that made it closer, I think.
Yeah.
That's the breakdown that I saw.
So as a Yankees fan, I'm obligated to say I think DJ, any of the three would have been worthy winners, but I think DJ was more than third place in that, my opinion. But they were all worthy winners.
Yeah.
LeMahieu had a great season.
Yeah, both on the field and in the clubhouse. I think he
Really.
provided some real leadership to a team that desperately needs leadership.
Yeah, I remember they had good things to say about him when he played in Colorado.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, both Cy Young award winners will probably end up with the Yankees anyhow. So there you go.
Yeah, that's easy to say. And I certainly have had my moments of thinking that too, but I personally don't think Trevor Bauer will end up there. I just don't think so. And I guess it's easy to say, well, you know, he and Cole didn't get along, but he said, you know, that was a long time ago, and a lot of water over the proverbial dam or under the bridge or whatever. But I just don't get that feeling that's in the cards. knowing Cashman, he'll sign some scrap heap player claiming what a deal I got, and it ends up being yet another bust. He's pretty good at doing that. He's established a track record in pitching of signing busts. It's interesting now. They're talking the Cardinals pitcher, that the innings eater that we used to have, and he got, let him go to free agency. Now they're talking about trading for him. You say, what do you not like about that model? You let the guy get away, and then you got to give back assets to get him. So we'll see, but I don't think he will end up there.
Yeah. Doesn't look like Bauer definitely is going to be in Cincinnati. I don't think they want to shell out that much money. He's going to demand a lot of money, I would think.
Well, he's changed his viewpoint. If I understand correctly what I read before, he was I'm going to do a series of 1-year deals.
Oh,
And that was his MO. But recently I saw something that said, I am open to a multi-year deal of the right type. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that maybe changes the landscape a little bit.
The right type probably involves multiple digits. 35,000 for 5 years or something. 35 million.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I think we'd buy him for 35,000 for 5 years. That sounds good.
The weird
I might
thing
buy
is,
him for that. He can mow my lawn and such. Yeah.
sometimes that magic with the pitching coach runs out. There for a while, I thought the Pirates pitching coach,
Yep.
Steerage. I mean, he was the pitching whisperer
Right,
for
yeah.
a while. I mean, taking Liriano and a couple other guys that we got for bargains, and then but eventually the magic wore out.
Well, the Yankees fired Larry Rothschild. Oh, here's a guy, he's seen his best day, right? And we're going to bring this phenom in from the Indians, and outward inly looking, he flamed out. And somehow Rothschild got smarter again when he went to the West Coast, to the Padres. So I agree with you, Blake. It's an amazing stock up today, stock cratering tomorrow, right?
Yeah. Hi, Steve. Hi, Mike. Andres.
Good morning.
Blake, you or Steve Leppert might know, was Bieber and Bauer at Columbus Clipper at the same time or not? I don't think they were they? I know they both played for the Clippers at one time.
Yeah. I don't remember Bauer being. I barely remember him being in Columbus.
Didn't he come to Columbus when they first traded for him, or not?
It could be. I remember just seeing Bieber a lot, but I don't recall seeing. I mean, I don't really remember seeing Bauer here. I mean, he may have, but it's like I felt like I was on a good rotation every time I went to the ballpark. Every other game, it seemed like it was Bieber's turn. Hi, Leslie.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Morning, everybody.
Morning, Leslie.
Morning.
I think you're right, Blake. I don't think he was with the Columbus team very long when the Indians got him. I'm trying to remember myself. I don't think he was there very long, if at all.
If anybody has baseball reference up, we could probably look that up. I'm trying to make sure I admit everybody in who wants in. Leslie, thanks for coming. Thanks for being our guest.
No problem. My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Blake, how are your daughters and families doing?
They're doing good. My son-in-law just changed jobs, and he's now officially an employee of a Columbus firm. You know, he had been working remotely from Chicago since
Yeah.
they had the baby, with plans to move here, but permanently move here only when he got a job. So anyways, that happened a week ago. So they're now looking for a house in the area.
Oh, you all must be pretty pleased.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed blessing. I mean, it's been great having, you know, the baby in the house for the last, you know, 8 months or so. And but on the other hand, I'll be happy to have my garage back because all their stuff's in our garage, and it's starting to get cold. And it's been a few years since I've had to go outside and scrape my car.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
Really important stuff.
that's right.
Well, it's momentarily important when you're out there with a scraper.
Yeah. Hey, Rob.
Good morning. How's everybody doing?
Good. Morning, Rick.
Jim, did the OSU baseball team do anything this fall, or are they just kind of lying low?
Nothing public, but on Twitter, I kept seeing some things showing workouts. So evidently they were active. It's just that, you know, they didn't invite people to come to their Scarlet and Gray World Series. I don't even think they had it, but they did work out. I kept seeing things on Twitter about it.
Okay,
And of course, they just recently they
Alright,
announced
good.
all their
Just had a,
recruits. Sorry.
no, I just had a slew of admittance.
You did.
Was backed up. Yep.
Looks like we got a crowd today.
We have a crowd today. We're up to 19.
Morning, Rick.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I think I finally figured out I was not unmuted. I was sitting here talking to everybody and nobody was talking to me. I thought, well, I'm off to a bad start.
Mary Beth, welcome.
Rough crowd.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah. Hi, Wayne.
Hey,
Tom.
Hello,
Who else
Blake.
snuck?
How's everyone?
Good. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Leslie.
glad to be here. Thanks.
Morning.
Hi, Drew. Mr. Miller,
Hello, Blake.
Yeah.
Big
I'm,
Mike.
yeah. I'm sorry to say, Blake, but my ball player in the back is Jake Wood. You can't see the top of him, but that's who he is.
All right. So noted. There's my picture. Well, while we're about ready to start here, I thought it would be helpful before I introduce our esteemed guest today, just get a feel for what books people read in the last few months in preparation for this, just so we kind of know what the landscape looked like, where there was, I think, more great books than ever to choose from. So I'm going to go across my screen. So I'll call on each one. If you just tell me what books you read, we'll try to get this through quick. Joe Shaw.
Well, I read Leslie's book, and I would say this even if she weren't here, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it really helped me gain a much greater appreciation for not only the history, but the complexity of the history of the Negro League baseball. I'm looking forward to hearing her comments this morning.
Jim?
I also read Leslie's book, The Negro Leagues, 1869 to 1960. Thanks,
Dave?
Leslie.
I read Shades of Glory, or I'm reading Shades of Glory. I'm, as usual, behind on my reading, but it's been interesting to discover how much went on in black baseball prior to 1920. There was a
Dave Scott?
more.
The Mays autobiography by Marty Apple. That's a couple years old. I enjoyed that one.
Larry?
Invisible Man and Saul White's Baseball God.
Ooh.
Steve?
Well, I've read 9 books over the past year, all related somewhat to the Negro Leagues, but the one I wrote or read recently this past week, and I'll give you a brief history without too much name dropping. My wife is dear friends with a lady that grew up in Stamford, Connecticut, and was one of Jackie Robinson's best friends. They're still in contact. Jackie Robinson's wife was her den mother in Girl Scouts, so she's been on the Robinson property and in the basement of their home, and she knew the entire family well. But anyway, the name of her book is Sharon Robinson, that's the author, Child of the Dream, a memoir of 1963.
Very cool.
Which was given to me by my wife's friend to read. So I said, perfect, I'll read it this week for the book club.
Mary Death?
I read Only the Ball Was White, and then I'm kind of midway through The Soul of Baseball and the Oscar Charleston book.
Rick?
I read Only the Ball Was White, which was one of the original books, 1970, but I had a 1999 edition, so I got a little bit of extra perspective. Very good book.
Wayne?
So I also did the Soul of Baseball, the Buck O'Neill book on it, and I'll just comment, it's probably one of the most enjoyable reads I've had. You know, I just look forward to the time I'd pick up that book and read another chapter.
Yeah. Tom?
I read 2 books, the same one that Wayne did about Buck O'Neill, and I also read the book about Satchel Paige.
Ernie?
I had a beer and read the Oscar Charleston book.
All right. Jim? Toodle?
Okay, yeah. Let's see. I got in Invisible Man, and I'm parts of there you go. Parts of the Shades of Glory.
John Blackman?
Those are very good.
I read Leslie's book, Negro Leagues from 1920 to 1960. I was impressed with the depth and research he did for that book.
Drew?
2, I read the Effa Manley book, The Most Famous Woman in Baseball, and I had multiple beers, and I read the Oscar Charlton book.
Okay.
I'm a
Big
slower
Mike.
reader.
Mike Green?
I read Leslie's book. I also went back to the old SABR journals that we get, and there's been a couple that have been cover to cover. And they had a lot of nice, interesting stories about specific teams and specific owners, which I thought was fun.
Rob?
I read Leslie's book as well. Really enjoyed it.
Dave Philpott? Mute.
He's yeah.
There we go. This is a book that I read years ago, and I just kind of paged through it for this week, and it's not on the list. It's Neil Langtot's Negro League Baseball, University of Pennsylvania Press, and then somewhat related, Harry Edwards' Revolt of the Black Athlete, which is mostly about Olympic athletes, but he ties in like Curt Flood and some things like that in the book, written in the late 1960s.
Andres?
Well, let's put it in that way that I'm from Europe, and I first heard about Negro League about 2 months ago. But I already have downloaded some books and started with Jackie Robinson's story by Rampersad. So yeah, well, let's say in that way that I have heard about it, and I know well the core, but and some basic things, but nothing specific.
Okay. Mike Curtin?
As someone who's been umpiring at the high school level for 20 years, I like getting and reading books by and about umpires. And so I found this book titled Ruling Over Monarchs, Giants, and Stars by Bob Motley, who was a legendary umpire in the Negro Leagues. And it was fascinating to read his account of calling balls and strikes when Satchel Paige was in his prime in the Negro Leagues, and also umpiring for in the early 50s when Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and Ernie Banks were coming through the Negro Leagues before going up to the majors.
All right. Do you have that book with you? Turn your video on and show people the cover, since that's a first. There you go. Yeah. I just wanted people to see that it's an awesome cover with the that's the leaping umpire.
And Blake, there's a new edition that just came out this past week, because of the 100th anniversary, that's got new information and all kinds of on that same book. So if you're going to get it, I'd get it, the new one, because it's got a whole bunch of additional information on it.
Good tip. Jeff?
Morning, everyone. I read most of Leslie's book, not all of it, but it was good.
Bill? Nowlin?
Yeah, this is the, I've read many of the books that people have mentioned. This is the one I've read most recently by Bill Young on the Kansas City Monarchs.
And for those who don't know, one of the books I read, besides Invisible Men and rereading Leslie's book, the Pride of Smoketown, which is about the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords. It's only been out a couple months, but anyway, Bill was the editor.
One of the editors.
One of the editors. Yep. So anyways, Bill, great to have you join us today.
Happy to be listening in.
Yeah. Mark Miller? All right, Mark might have stepped away. Let me introduce Leslie. I'm not sure I need to introduce her. I think if you read your SABR notes, she's often in it, but she heads up. First of all, she's a assistant history professor at Kent State, the Stark County branch. She probably would modestly not say this, but in 2015, she was the Ohio History College Teacher of the Year. She heads up the Women in Baseball Committee for SABR. She recently, with the International Women's Baseball Conference or Baseball Center in Rockford, they recently put on a conference this summer, and it's an annual thing, and they highlighted African American women in baseball. She's written a bunch of books, including the groundbreaking book that many of us read, along with the countless stories on Satchel and the Kansas City Monarchs, black baseball in Chicago, and a lot, a lot. And I think, Leslie, you're currently working on a book on the Colorado Silver Bullets, a women's baseball team. So I think those were the main things I wanted to bring up. I could go on and on. You've written countless essays, and in fact, in the 3 SABR books that have come out on Newark, Pride of Smoketown, and A Bittersweet Goodbye, you had entries in those books as well. So you've been busy, and we appreciate. We're thrilled to have you as our guest today. To get things started, just tell us how you got interested in picking this history, because at the time that you would have started this, there weren't this plethora of books out there, other than Only the Ball Was White. There wasn't a lot out there.
That's true. But first, let me just say thank you. I appreciate the invite. I always enjoy talking about the Negro Leagues, so this is always fun. And as I was listening to all the books, I was pleased to say, though I'm like, did I miss one? I have read all of them, so that is a good thing. And in fact, they're all probably sitting here on my bookshelf, but all very good choices as well. But well, I've always had an interest in baseball, just from as long as I can remember. And for those who don't know, I am a Mets fan. So growing up, hearing my dad was a Yankees fan. I grew up in New York, so there's always the story behind why did I become a Mets fan when my dad was a Yankees fan, but that's a different story. Just liking baseball in general, hearing stories, and liking history. When I got into school, the idea that there was this players out there, Satchel Paige being one of the first ones, that I had just couldn't find much information about, just really didn't know anything about. And so that intrigued me. And so when I got into grad school is really when I discovered this opportunity. Didn't realize that you could actually take a topic like this, and use that for your PhD study, which is what I did. Well, master's and PhD. But literally, I was taking a class on, you're going to love the labor history. And so I had to find a topic, and I was in the library one day, and I was literally going up and down the shelves trying to find something that would interest me. And I was kind of thinking I was going to settle on child labor, because I thought, that sounds interesting. I'll do something on that. And one of my fellow grad students, he was a PhD candidate at the time, saw me in the library, and he came up and he asked me what I was doing. And I told him, and he said, well, what would you really like to do? And I said, well, I'd love to do something with baseball, but they'd never let me. And his comment was, why not? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I just assumed. So I went and asked, and my professor said, well, of course there's labor in baseball. You can do that. And that's what led me into my discovery and opportunity to begin with the Negro Leagues. And I've been doing it ever since. And so it really was part luck, because otherwise I might be doing child labor history today, which would not be nearly as much fun or as interesting. So that's really literally how I got into it on the academic side of things, was just somebody telling me, well, why not? Go ahead and give it a try. And of course, as Blake mentioned, this was more years ago than I care to remember, but I will admit it was in the late 1980s, when I was starting out in my master's program. So the number of books, opportunity was there for me to delve into this in a way, simply because not very many people had done it yet. And that was what was intriguing to me.
And so you're off on this, getting a good yes, you can go ahead and do it. And then you started doing the research. And how easy was it to find things on the Negro Leagues?
Well, again, thinking about the time frame, It improved a little bit over the 6 or 7 years I was in grad school between master's and PhD, but certainly long before we have the opportunity with the internet today. And so much of my research had to be done, which is the true fun part of being a historian, was going to the archives, going to the actual newspapers themselves, reading them on microfilm, microfiche, going out to the University of Kansas and going through their records, going to Temple University and going through theirs, literally getting, which we, today everybody sends everything electronically, but getting huge packages in the mail of materials from the Library of Congress and things like that. Much more difficult, but that's how I also found SABR. And when I was doing my research, I read from Bob Peterson's work and simply sent a letter to Larry Lester and Dick Clark, and that brought a lot of opportunities for the research and things as well, just simply knowing Dick and Larry and John Holloway and Jim Riley and the other early folks who were working on the Negro League stuff. But definitely different than it is today. Today, anybody, the stats weren't there in the way they are today. If you look at seam heads and you can follow, but you can find so much more. Bob Peterson's book, Only the Ball Was White, Invisible Men were among the few, Don Rogerson's book, that were out there. The Complete History of the Negro Leagues, written by Mark Grabowski, actually came out the year I was finishing up my dissertation. It actually came out 2 weeks before I was supposed to defend my dissertation. And you can imagine, if you're thinking about defending your dissertation on a topic and a book comes out titled The Complete History of what you're working on, it was a bit of a panic, but I went and read it and I was like, oh, it's okay. It has, within the first chapter, there were multiple errors and multiple things that were wrong with it. So I was like, okay, I'm good. But I did panic for a moment when that came out, because it came out literally 2 weeks before I defended my dissertation. And I was like, I might have to start all over again, but I didn't have to. So, so the research, it was also opportunity. There were more of the Negro Leaguers still alive. So opportunities to meet many of them who are no longer with us, and getting to interview some of them. Though it was interesting sometimes setting up some of the interviews, because some of the players, unfortunately, as people were just starting to get interested, didn't really necessarily understand how to approach them, how to deal with their stories correctly. And so some of them had become reluctant to do interviews until you kind of were able to show that, yes, you were sincere, yes, you were going to do things right, in order to make sure that their stories were not taken advantage of, or not expressed in the wrong ways, or people getting autographs and then selling them, things like that. That was always, and then of course, the other interesting thing for me doing the research, particularly with approaching some of the players and things, was initially they were rather surprised at who I was. And the question often came up as to how come I was interested. Writing baseball history, today there are many more women involved, but when I started, well, just even in SABR, there were 6 women that were significantly involved in SABR, and that was it. So this was also an interesting, and so sometimes they wondered, some of them were intrigued by it and much more willing to tell me stories, and others were kind of, they just weren't sure until they could discover that I actually knew what I was talking about. And that was often something I had to show, that yes, I was sincerely interested, I was a baseball fan, I understood, and I was a historian. So, but very, very different from the way you can do things today.
I'm just curious, who was your first interview? I feel like you'd never forget your first.
Very first interview that I did was with Ted Tolles.
Okay. So you started pretty big.
Well, yeah, but Ted was also local, so it was, in terms of Ohio,
Okay.
so it was easier to do that. And so he was the first one.
Did you have a favorite interview?
Wow, that's a tough question. There were a lot of them. Certainly Mamie Johnson would be one of those. Mamie could tell stories like nobody. She was a lot of fun.
Could you share with the group, if they don't know who Mamie Johnson is?
Mamie Johnson was one of the 3 well-known women who played in the 1950s. She was the pitcher for the Indianapolis Clowns in 1954. And of course, most people got to know her a little bit more in more recent years when Monet Davis pitched her shutout in the Little League World Series. And Monet got to meet Mamie and the conversations that went on between the two of them. But Mamie, nicknamed Peanut, because she stood about, well, in her prime, she stood about 5'3". By the time I met her, I think she was about 5'1". She had shrunk. Tiny little lady, but boy, could she tell stories. And she was a lot of fun to listen to. She loved to tell stories of striking out ball players, even if sometimes it turned out her memory wasn't exactly correct as to which ball player she might have struck out, but we all know that that happens in terms of tall tales that sometimes people tell. But getting to one of my very first opportunities to present my research, I was actually on a panel with Mamie. And so that was kind of I was a bit, oh my God, I'm being asked to do this. And then I'm sitting here with one of the people who actually played. So Mamie would certainly be one of them. John Mule Miles was another one I did much later, but John Mule Miles played for Chicago coming out of Texas. John is not as well known to most people. Never really did many interviews. He had a personality, if you want to compare him to Buck O'Neill. Very, very personable, loved everybody, just big, bold, all of those. That's who a lot of us he reminded in terms of personality. John, an outfielder, infielder combination, played both sometimes, but just a lot of fun to listen to and a joyful person to be around. He would be another one that I really enjoyed. And then, of course, I think the last one would be Double Duty Radcliffe, Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, as earning his nickname for pitching and catching. I met him first when he was probably about early 91, so got to interact with him over the years. And of course, he lived to be 103 or 4. He was a hoot. Nobody could tell story. I think Satchel could tell stories. I never got to meet, but Double Duty could tell stories. Half the time, I'm not sure they were true, but they were through Double Duty's lens of, he just liked to tell you the colorful side of people's characters. He loved, and his own as well. And one of the things that was always interesting with Double Duty was he had an eye for the ladies, and that was always a part of every story he told, because no matter where he was, there was a lady in the stands who caught his eye. There was a lady when they went out at night who caught his eye. Even if and so every story he told, no matter what it was, it always involved a lady at some point in the story. So those would probably be among the ones that I really enjoyed most, but I can't say there were any that I didn't enjoy.
Did you? I got a question from the chat line from Joe. Did you record these interviews or any of them?
Early on, I did not. Just simply, I in grad school, not having the resources necessarily and not thinking about most of them handwritten transcripts that I have. Later on, I do have some of them, but for the most part, the early ones, unfortunately, didn't often have, and a lot of them were over the phone. So it was, sometimes that was difficult too. Back then, the technology wasn't what it is today, sadly.
Okay. From the group, any questions so far?
Wow.
Leslie, this is Larry. I wanted to ask you about something that comes up in Invisible Men.
Okay.
Which was a kind of seemingly the ambivalence of a lot of the Negro League players about Jackie Robinson being the one who became the first signed but unorganized ball and then a major league player. They thought he wasn't in a way really fit for that role. What was the impression you got talking with people?
It's an interesting question, because I think sometimes some of the players were very cautious in what they had to say because they didn't want to give the impression that they were not supportive and they weren't happy that he was chosen chosen because they were in the sense that they were glad that someone was finally getting a chance. And it wasn't that Robinson was not a good player. The two issues that sometimes came up were the fact that he had very little experience, and he certainly had not played. And so he didn't, to some, he sort of hadn't earned his dues the way some of the other players had. And then some of them just outright said it was the other issue was that they didn't think he was the best player, and they thought the best player needed to make that chance. And they were afraid that if he wasn't the best player, it might not, the experiment, as Jules Tydell called it, it might not work. But overall, even with that said, I didn't find anybody, and it never really, who didn't say at the same time they were happy for him. They were happy. They would have been happy for any player that got that opportunity as long as it was going to work. But what they really wanted was to see a bunch of players go in, following Rube Foster's idea, which was a whole team going in, which never happened. But those were generally the kinds of things that players had to say.
Thank you.
Sure.
I got a question. Sorry, I'm trying to stay in the sun here, since it's rare. Leslie, from the time when you first researched to, let's say now, especially, well, with the conferences, the 100th anniversary, has your perception, or is there anything that's changed in terms of your perception, your understanding, your, like,
Yeah,
I just wonder. Yeah,
it's a great question. And my overall perceptions and things have not really changed because from doing the research the way I did it from the beginning, I understood more about the organization of the leagues, the fact that they were not as disorganized, that there were contracts, all of the things that a lot of people didn't really understand until more recently. And even still, you get people who don't really understand some of that. I think the biggest thing for me that has changed is the incredible work some other people, because I'm not as big on doing some of this kind of work, but the statistical work that really has brought some players to the forefront that we didn't know about and didn't realize would have, and certainly couldn't prove in any significant way. And so being able to take some of those stories out of sort of they're just stories, they're anecdotal, they're apocryphal. I mean, there's still lots of those, but that opportunity to be able to see some of that have the evidence that a lot of people want, because baseball fans are obviously huge on the statistical side of things, and being able to say, hey, here's what we've got. You can just go to Seamheads and we've got pretty solid, probably about 80% of most of those to 85% of most of those seasons have been found. And so that's a pretty significant change. So that would be the thing that I think for me has, just being able to say, well, that here's the home runs that we actually know were hit by this player. Here's the strikeouts that we know about, that kind of thing. I think has, and then I guess the other would be the growing extent of, which is what has always interested me the most, play outside of the organized Negro Leagues. It's always been very extensive, but we keep growing that picture as to the impact of the Negro Leagues with teams in small towns, leagues that pop up in small areas that simply a lot of their competition was Negro League teams coming through their towns, and the impact that that had in so many different places that people just are not aware of. I think that's the other thing is because research is so much, in some ways, so much easier to do today, finding and having access to a lot of things we didn't have before has opened up that picture as well.
Leslie, as this additional data became available and as a result of your research, do you have a all-time all-star team starting lineup that you would select?
I saw that.
I know it's kind of an unfair question, just like off the top of my head. Let me go through the positions, but one of our members
I see
asked
that.
that question.
I saw that pop up, and I was like, "Oh my!" Off the top,
so you've had time to think about it.
No, I just saw it, and I was like, "Ooh!" And then more questions came up, so I haven't really. Just a quick thought. I mean, and I'm not even really necessarily thinking strict positions here because that's the tougher part. But I would probably Josh Gibson, Oscar Charleston, Mule Suttles, Pop Lloyd, Pete Hill, Cristobal Torriente, Martin DeHigo, Buck Leonard, Satchel, Hilton Smith, Leon Day. I think I got most.
Thank you. The next question, again, in some of your interviews, Mark asked the question, did anybody mention Josh Gibson's health issues and how that might have affected his play and interaction with other players?
It didn't come up often. Most players simply talked about what an incredible athlete he was, what an incredible teammate he was, for the most part, and just generally what a fun-loving, quiet but fun-loving kind of guy he was. The rare occasion when it came up, it was more to say how unfortunate it was that he suffered, but a lot of players really weren't fully aware of the issues that Josh had. It never seemed to be something that affected his play in any significant way to most people's realizations. And so it was not something that they would say, yeah, we were all aware of it. It was kind of more, it was just one of those things. And they were much more interested in talking about who he was as a player, as a person, the incredible skill he had both as a hitter and as a catcher. Most of them, their real conversation was about the lack of credit he got and continues to get for being an outstanding catcher, as well as obviously the home run hitter that everybody recognizes him as.
Okay. Then the next one comes from Dave Philippi. Do you know much about the Spec, Bebop, and King Tut King? Dave's a film curator for Wexner Arts Center. He said he found a film clip of them doing a Harlem Globetrotters type act at the Polo Grounds in the late 40s. Maybe they did a barnstorming tour with Jackie Robinson in the 50s. He says question mark.
Yeah, I don't.
They've done some acts.
They're one of those examples of probably much more to be found on their particular story. I'm guessing you're probably referring to the film clip that the Library of Congress has. Is that the one you're referring to? I don't.
Dave?
It was UCLA actually, but it's possible, because the different newsreel companies would send out their own companies, and so maybe the Library of Congress has similar footage.
Yeah, because I've seen the Library of Congress is the one that I have seen, and they found themselves playing with the Harlem Globetrotters actual baseball team, and so they were a part of the Harlem Globetrotters baseball team in the late 40s, and so traveled around as the traveling show for the most part. We have some. I have some advertisements from the newspapers that show both of them as the sort of lead act for the Harlem Globetrotters baseball team. And that's where, of course, they worked with Goose Tatum, because Tatum was the third in that tandem that typically were shown on the advertisements. As far as going on a barnstorming tour with Jackie Robinson, I don't believe that they did. I think Goose Tatum was the only one that did. I don't think the other, as far as I'm aware, I don't think the other two did.
One other thing I was just going to mention, since you mentioned Mule Suttles, I found just raw footage of a Negro League game. I think it was the Eastern League, the Washington Pilots and the Philadelphia Hilldale Giants from 1932. And since you mentioned Mule Suttles, I'm pretty sure he was like one of the few players I could identify as playing in that game. It's totally
That's
raw
cool.
footage. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was
Well,
cool.
Mule was certainly very distinctive and easy to pick out for his size.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then if you saw him hitting, you'd also know it was him just by the size of his bat. So that reminds me, one of the coolest things I've ever had a chance to do is I was at the Louisville Slugger Museum shortly after they discovered one of the 2 Negro League bats that they have, and one of them is Mule Suttles. So they took me back into the bat vault and let me take a picture swinging Mule Suttles' bat. It was very cool.
Oh.
It was very cool. It was a heavy bat. I don't remember not as heavy as it is often portrayed, and I can't remember the exact, but it was just a cool experience to get to do that.
In this last week, several of us attended a session on the renaming of the MVP award for either Josh Gibson or Frank Robinson. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I attended the very first one that Sean did, and I've talked to Sean about this. And the idea of renaming it for either of them is a marvelous idea. It should go to, it's certainly long overdue that it should not have been have Landis's name on that, in my humble opinion, should not have had Landis's name on that particular trophy. So I'm very glad to see that change. And I think you could make an argument for both players. Certainly the Josh Gibson argument is a recognition of all those who never got the opportunity, and drawing those players up and recognizing those, and that is an important idea in terms of changing the narrative. And so I think, and then of course Frank Robinson and everything that he brought to the game, you could make an argument for him as well. So in my opinion, either of those would be a great change.
Okay. You'd mentioned that a white player was signed for the Negro Leagues. Was there ever any attempts to integrate baseball by signing more white players? And was there any attempt to sign Shoeless Joe Jackson after he was banned?
I am not aware of any attempt to sign Shoeless Joe. I've never seen anything that would indicate that occurred. It's always a possibility that some conversation was had, but I am not aware, certainly not in any of the research that I have done. Eddie Clapp, of course, is the most famous of the white players that was signed into the Negro Leagues. And that's the one that has received the most attention. And you're going to ask me the names of the others, and off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to tell you, but there are at least 3 others who played. And so Eddie Clapp was not a completely unique experience, but it was a rarity to sign onto an official Negro Leagues team. What we do find instead, of course, are lots of integrated teams in some of the smaller towns and some of the barnstorming teams that the Negro Leagues played against. It was a little more common to see that kind of thing occurring, depending on where you were. The best example we have of that kind of attempt is the Denver Post tournament that was held every year of semi-pro. And so some of the Negro League teams, both Black players going on to white teams, but also a couple of just sort of creating a more all-star like team to take out there for the Denver Post tournament. And so that's the kind of, but no, nothing more extensive than that within the Negro Leagues. Mostly because I would just say, again, the same issue of where they going places to play, you're going to have the same issue of the acceptance of an integrated team, regardless of which way it was integrated. That's the experience Eddie Clapp found, right? They went down, and because they had a white player, so it was they weren't going to let him in. So that was the issue, no matter which direction it went.
Has anyone ever collected the apocryphal stories that how would a historian handle that? And I'm not sure I'm reading the word right.
We're certainly, I mean, in our interviews and things like that, we have all of these stories, the stories of Josh Gibson and others hitting home. I mean, I have a story of Luke Easter hitting a home run in Toledo at Swain Field, which is no longer there, but the railroad tracks on the backside of Swain Field are still there. And supposedly, according to local stories, he hit a ball that went out of the ball field and actually landed on the train as it was passing by, and the ball kept going. You know, it's a great story. Did it happen? I
Yeah,
have
it is.
no idea. There's no way to, you know, you look in the newspapers.
It could happen. So.
It could have happened. And certainly newspapers highlighted his incredible strength. And so the idea that he hit one out of the ballpark, no doubt that probably happened, having seen the dimensions of the field and things, but whether he actually hit one onto a moving train as it went by. But those are the kinds of stories that you can use as a historian to sort of show people the difference. And I use them with my students a lot of times to show them the difference between a story like that and a story that you can back up with evidence. And what do you do and how do you use it? Can you use it? Sure. As a way of showing the kinds of things and the way people tell stories and how things change over time and people's memories, right? And then what do you do to try to find the evidence to back that up? You know, there's tons of stories about Satchel Paige that we wonder, and are they told correctly? Have they been passed down correctly? They were not written down. We have some of them because, you know, there's so many interviews, but with players where we don't have those kinds of interviews and things, a lot of this remains and will remain hidden in those. And that's the stuff that makes I think that makes all of this fascinating, makes the players come alive. And we have a duty and a responsibility to try to indicate to people when the stories are apocryphal or mythical or legend, and when they are something that we can back up with some evidence.
In your stories, I mean, the books I read, including yours, I mean, it sounds in many ways that the barnstorming trips where they were just packing in all kinds of extra games in order to really make a living out of it, they seem to wear the hard lifestyle that came with that. They wear it as a badge of honor almost. What were your impressions of that?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
did more people really believe that?
I think, well, they just saw it as a part of what they did. And it just was part of their life. It was a part of what was necessary. It was a part of the fun sometimes but it was hard. They made no bones about, but it was just part of what, most of the time it was just part of what they did. It was, you went wherever you needed to, you got to play. The hard part was usually the travel, the lack of opportunities of places to sleep sometimes and having to travel all night. Those, many of them would admit, wasn't necessarily fun, but the end of the day, the fun part was they still got to play baseball, and they got to travel all over. And for the most part, that was generally the gist of what most people have to say. Not denying the difficulties and the hardships, everything as you've all read, all the different kinds of things that happened, the accidents that happened, some of the getting run out of town in places, things like that went along with it. Certainly were not easy, but certainly not something that many of them would have traded away their experience, right? And so that's generally, the barnstorming was just necessary. For many of them, that's how they the opportunity to see so much of the country was hugely important and interesting, and something they never would have gotten to do otherwise, and certainly thinking about the time frame that we're talking about, that certainly was true. And in many cases, probably wouldn't have been able to be in some of the places they were in unless they were there as part of a baseball team and the community was a little more accepting of them coming into play.
Thanks. Has there ever been a movement, or is there one now, to make any of the Negro Leagues to be designated as a major league?
That's a very timely question.
The Negro...
Yeah. So there is currently, for the first time in a serious fashion, there is some discussion of that particular idea. Back in the late 60s, when the encyclopedia for Major Leagues came out, discussions had about what was going to be included and what was not. If you read the interviews that were done with David Neff and some of the others who were involved in that, it appears that the Negro Leagues, not surprisingly, weren't even a part of the discussion. And so not included in that. But this year, with it being the centennial of the Negro Leagues, with some of the other things that have gone on in the country, and I think the decision to take Landis's name off the MVP trophy is part of that larger. There is some discussion that Major League Baseball is at least entertaining the idea of looking into this. What will come of it will be interesting to see how this plays out. But vast majority of those who on the scholarship side would argue that it should happen, and it should happen likely for the time period between 1920 and 1948, recognizing that the before, particularly after 48, is not really probably not a good argument for that. But looking at that time period, whether they would recognize, probably it would be the Negro National League, the Eastern Colored League, the Second Negro National League, and the Negro American League. It would be likely those four, and not any. There were obviously others that were in there for a year or two, and then the Negro Southern League. But the Negro Southern League, typically seen even by the Negro Leagues themselves as more of a minor league system, and so not likely. But that is where the conversation is at right now. So it'll be interesting to see what Major League Baseball decides to do with that particular idea.
The next question was, do you have a favorite black baseball movie?
Well, there aren't very many of them, so probably 42. Simply because, Soul of the Game is an interesting one. It's a lot of it is not based in it's again one of those kind of movies where you've created a dialogue that we don't know happened because we don't have the conversations between those players and things like that. It's an interesting movie. Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars is the one that people often find and are introduced to. It's an interesting one. It's got lots of issues and things like that, but it's definitely worth watching, certainly. But I think 42 really tried to do a pretty good job of much of telling the story of the very specific period that they were looking at, downplaying, unfortunately, the role of the Wendell Smith and Sam Lacey, the reporters. But other than that, it's a pretty good movie.
And any thoughts on the owners who really were trying to operate their teams on a shoestring budget and trying to hold their teams together?
The owners are such a widely diverse and interesting group across the board. Talking about a new book, if anybody's looking for one to read, you should read Jim Overmeyer's newest book on Composy. That gives you another look at one of the owners. The owners haven't, Bill mentioned that he just read the J.L. Wilkinson book on Kansas City Monarchs. There, not a lot of the owners, F.A. Manley, J.L. Wilkinson, now Composy. There aren't a lot of them that have had books specifically written about them and their involvement. But some of them, like Wilkinson, had very solid economic background because of obviously being a white owner, made him a little unique, particularly in the Negro National League. But he had good businesses to back that up. When you look at somebody like Gus Greenlee, who hasn't received as much attention maybe as he should, Gus, like a number of others, Abe Manley, were involved in the numbers game in the Pittsburgh area and in their communities, which obviously numbers game viewed very differently within the Black community than it is from outside that community, often seen outside the community as gambling and things like that. They didn't quite see it that way. It was much more a part of the community and a way to survive. And so the owners are, yeah, many of them, Rube Foster included, you know, doing what they could to run a business, make a living. And after all, for most of them, that's what came first. You know, for Ethel Manley, the idea that first and foremost, they needed to make their paychecks regularly, that they needed to make the payroll. And so she saw that as a very important part of their responsibility. That wasn't necessarily always the case with all of the owners. Some of them struggled simply because of the communities they were in. You know, so Joe would know this coming out of Cleveland, right? The idea that Cleveland had, and this is not necessarily more Negro League teams than any other city. And that's because most of them couldn't survive past a year. So there was constant change and a lot of that had to do with the lack of support that they received and the inability to make payrolls. You know, the owner of the, John Matthews, the owner of the Dayton Marcos, really interesting guy. And the Dayton Marcos, of course, are only a Negro League team for one season, but the team lasted for nearly 20 as a independent barnstorming team. Much easier for them where they didn't have to make the guarantees of being a part of the league and things like that. So the owners vary dramatically, but overall, the vast majority of them definitely struggled to keep their teams, with the exception of somebody like J.L. Wilkinson, Chicago, American Giants under Foster, and then later leadership of the Giants, Homestead Grays, Pittsburgh Crawfords, but they're the rarity that, and you can see that in just in terms of their longevity in the league.
One of the individuals who was one of the more colorful players and a great interview is Buck O'Neill. Do you have any unique stories about Buck in your interviews? I assume you got to talk to him as well.
Oh, many times. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Buck was a character, and Buck just loved to tell stories, and Buck just loved people. And that, I mean, that came across every time you met him. But I think the most impressive thing that sort of told you who Buck O'Neill was way back at our very first and only Jerry Malloy conference that we had in Memphis. Buck came and he was there as for that experience. He joined us for part of the conference, and we went to a Redbirds game. And after the game, some of the Redbird players came out and they had a table set up outside to sign autographs. And Buck was at the end of the table also signing autographs. I don't remember, and this is where memory, but it was, all I remember is it was incredibly hot and humid that day. I don't know if it was 95, 94, but it was, and the lineup of people just kept coming. And within about an hour, all of the young players, the Redbird players, basically got up, they were done, and didn't matter to them that there was this long line of people still. Buck stayed until every single person in the line got to talk to him, got a picture, got an autograph, and he spent time talking to every single person. A number of us stayed with him, and that's all he just said. These people came out. Who am I to not give them that opportunity? He thought it was his responsibility. It was part of it, but he also loved doing it, and he loved just getting a chance to shake hands with people and thank them for. And that was typical of Buck, to thank them for their interest. And then he'd want to tell a story about Satchel. Satchel was usually his favorite character to tell stories about, and then others. But that was sort of quintessential Buck, to watch him sitting out there. And at that point, he was in his late 80s. And so, you know, and he, by at least a couple of hours, I mean, he was out there probably, if I want to say 3.5 to 4 hours sitting out there talking to people in the hot sun, and wasn't going to leave until everybody got a chance to talk to him.
Great story, really great story. I know that probably a number of us have read The Soul of the Game. And it was truly heartbreaking that as such an ambassador for a whole era of baseball, that alone didn't get him into the Hall of Fame, as well as being a terrific ball player. I mean, anyways, the story just tracks with what that book was all about. That's a baseball classic, not just a Negro
Poznansky
League
did a
classic.
beautiful job of capturing Buck.
Yeah. I meant to ask this question when we were kind of talking about the owners. Meredith asked, is there any other owners that you think would be prime for the Hall of Fame?
Sure. I think there's a couple, certainly. C.I. Taylor, certainly from the Indianapolis ABCs. Taylor, unfortunately, died fairly early and young, and most of his career came before the foundation of the Negro Leagues, so it makes it a tougher argument, as always. But the one that and this is something I've been working on for a while now, but other projects keep interrupting it, but one day it'll get done, is J.B. Martin of the Memphis Red Sox. J.B. Martin, along with his three brothers, owned the Memphis Red Sox. And then Martin, of course, went on to own the Chicago American Giants. So he's an owner of 2 teams, but Martin also was president of the second Negro National League, and then the Negro American League, and has the longest tenure as president of one of the leagues. And so I think J.B. Martin, you could make an argument putting together the case for him as both an owner and an executive of the league over a more than 20-year time frame, which is pretty significant. And so I would make the argument certainly for him, along with some others, but that would be one. And he's not one that seems to get, because the Memphis Red Sox, of course, played a lot of their games in the Negro Southern League before they became part of the more recognized Negro League. So they're not necessarily always recognized as heavily.
Thanks. In your discussions, did you talk with either the wives or families of players, and what was their perception of players being in the Negro National Leagues, and how it involved? And all that it involved.
Sure. Over the years, I've had a chance, particularly in more recent years, as some of the players are no longer with us, but talking to members of the family, for example, of Turkey Starnes, with his daughters and granddaughters. And I did have the chance to meet Nettie, Turkey's wife, before she passed away. She joined us at one of the Negro League conferences, Jerry Malloy Negro League conferences as well. So, but Joyce and Rosalind Stearns, probably talked to them over the years more than any of the other family members that I've met. And they had the distinct privilege of actually being old enough to remember their father and to have stories that weren't just passed down. And talking to them, talking to Satchel Paige's kids, because I've met all of them, conversations with them over the years. Sharon Robinson, the common story that you hear from many of them was if they were old enough to actually remember them themselves, was meeting some of the other players and not realizing how important it was that these were just people who came over to their house. And they were just little kids who thought this was kind of cool that all these people were, and all these players, but they didn't really understand it until much later. And then realizing, well, yeah, I met those people. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know that what Dad was actually doing. I didn't realize the importance. Those are the kind of common stories that you would hear from most of the kids who, now Rodney Page, Alan Page's son, who owned down in New Orleans, he told me a couple of interesting stories just recently, actually, about Fabiola Wilson, who played a female player, who played for a couple of teams down in the New Orleans area for his dad. She was actually his babysitter. And so he was telling me stories about her as his babysitter. And he didn't realize what else she was doing until he went out one day and saw her coaching third base and realized that that was his babysitter on the field, which is kind of fun. And he just remembered how much fun she was as a little kid, and then discovered that she was out there coaching third base for the New Orleans Black Pelicans. And so that's the kind of stories that you hear from some of the players' families.
I skipped over part of one of Rick's questions. In terms of, we talked about owners that might deserve election to the Hall of Fame. What about players? Do any players stand out to you that, like, why isn't this guy in the Hall of Fame?
Oh, sure. There's quite a few. I mean, I think, you know, most of you probably know Ted Knorr and his discussions about Rap Dixon and the desire to see Rap Dixon. Pete Gorton makes a great case for John Donaldson and putting John Donaldson in the Hall of Fame. You've got a player like, those two certainly come to mind immediately. Chino Smith, unfortunately, falls slightly short of that, just slightly short of that 10-year idea that the Hall of Fame has that you have to have played, because he unfortunately met a very young end, but his stats certainly put him at the top of almost every offensive category that you can see. So certainly he would be another one. So those are just a couple right off the top of my head that certainly would be worthy. But if you go back, probably to look at the list from the 2006 election, you know, the 35 players who were on the short list, the other 18 who didn't make it all have good cases. And certainly 14 years have passed, so the statistical data is much stronger now for probably all of them.
Okay. We got a question from Mark about the nickname Giants was a very prevalent nickname for the Negro League teams.
Mm-hmm.
You want to comment on that?
Oh, sure. The general idea is that it was a very popular name in sports in general, particularly among white teams, and a well-known name. And so the idea of picking up on that notion and sort of capitalizing on that popularity that was already there. There is some suggestion by historians that and other scholars that the idea was very deliberate to use the name to sometimes, I guess you could say, fool the fans into thinking they were coming to see a white team playing and not necessarily realizing that it was going to be an all black team. And so once they were there, willing to give that an opportunity. The other argument, of course, is just the name itself, and the idea of thinking about when you're choosing a sports name, to choose something that portrays the way you want to be seen and the effort to promote themselves in a particular way. And that was certainly, so I think the first is probably the much stronger argument, is the recognition the name already had.
Any thoughts on the Columbus teams that were here? And we think maybe double duty, Radcliffe played here.
That's a pretty strong support that he did. In fact, I think I've got at least one newspaper article that might indicate that. The Columbus teams, of course, were fairly short-lived, unfortunately, and usually a team that was transplanted from somewhere else to come down to Columbus for a short period of time, and often seen kind of like the Dayton Marcos as one of those, and a lot of the Cleveland teams that sort of came in and out without necessarily, unfortunately, a lot of local support. And so it made it tough for the teams to make it in and survive for any extended period of time. Trying to think about other players who would have, off the top of my head, I should have thought about that, that played for Columbus. I can't, right off the top of my head, think of any specific players. Unfortunately, I apologize for that.
It's okay.
Can I, Blake, can I jump in?
Yeah, go.
I've got baseball reference pages that I printed off for 3 Columbus teams: the 21 Buckeyes,
Right.
33 Bluebirds, and the 35 Elite Giants. And I found double duty Radcliffe on the roster for the 33 Bluebirds.
Right.
46 plate appearances and a 1-1 pitching record.
Thank you. I was pretty sure he was
So-
on one of those teams, but I couldn't remember for sure.
Yeah, and Pop Lloyd also.
On the early one, the 21 team?
Yes.
The 21 Buckeyes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay, cool.
yeah. So thanks for that.
Do you know there was a one of those transplanted teams from the Negro Southern League, the Columbus Turf, sometimes called the Turf Stars, finished out the 1932 season, but they were played down in Neal Park.
Okay.
They came and went.
Yep. Well, and a lot of the teams did that. You know, Toledo is the same way. They have a bunch of teams that come in and out of there too, as they're finishing out a season, or a team leaves mid-season and they need to bring somebody else in to fill the schedule for the Negro Leagues, and so they find a transplanted team and put it in a Cincinnati.
Leslie,
Same thing.
Could you talk about the importance of the black newspaper coverage to the viability of the franchises?
Oh, sure.
And is this part of the reasoning for why Cleveland had so many short-lived teams?
I think absolutely the black press was essential to the survival and the economic integrity of some of these teams. You know, you can argue that the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier in particular, you know, had national editions, as did the Afro-American, which had a Washington edition, a Baltimore edition, and things like that. But where you have good, strong black press, you see longevity among some of the teams. Where you don't, you typically see teams struggle, because even though the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier have national editions and they're picking up some of those teams, you got to remember that this happened even with white newspapers in the time period we're looking at, but it was even more prevalent. Most black newspapers were weeklies, so they're going to pick up, and particularly the national, they're going to pick up the coverage even less, right? And then they're not sending reporters for the most part to follow the teams. They're relying on the teams to send in their information, or someone else, so they're picking it up from another newspaper. So it's one of the problems when you're doing research as a consequence, because sometimes you'll know that a game was played, so you look in the next week's paper, but it's a week later and it didn't get picked up because something else has bumped it out that didn't get sent in. Sometimes it gets picked up 2 weeks later. But you think about, you know, Cleveland had the Call and Post, right? And so it did have a black newspaper that did cover and quite well, but it didn't have a reach beyond really Cleveland. Whereas you think about even the Kansas City Call, the St. Louis Argus, some of these other black newspapers had significant reach beyond just their primary city. And I think that certainly helps. You look at I think the sort of comparison that you can find is the Norfolk Journal and Guide, which is a black newspaper that most people are not familiar with. And you look at a city like Norfolk and you think, and they had lots of sort of minor Negro League teams going in and out. But what they covered more extensively was the barnstorming because of teams coming. And so the Norfolk Journal and Guide, but as a consequence, Norfolk was never able to really support a significant, you look at Cincinnati, the same thing, Toledo, the same thing, even Columbus, right? The lack of, and so where I think anyone would argue that the presence of the black press certainly both helped and sometimes ultimately in the end with the integration issues could hurt black baseball as well.
So given what you're saying, what do you think about the quality of the statistics that Seamheads is capturing and sharing today?
They're
kind of a follow-up
they're
to
by
that.
far certainly the best ones we have. There's no doubt about that. If you're looking for the best stats that you're going to get in the Negro Leagues, that would be the place. They're as strong as they're going to be when you look at they're based on actual box scores as opposed to just simple, an article in the paper kind of thing and trying to piece together from what's said in the article. So they're based, and in most cases, the effort was made to try to find multiple box scores where they could that might indicate the same game so that you could check it again for the accuracies. Obviously, like any, and I mean, it's certainly true, Major League Baseball, minor league baseball, particularly the farther you go back, the more problematic some of those things are. Newspapers make mistakes all the time, but I think they're as strong as you're going to get.
In your interviews, Mike had mentioned that he read the Bob Motley book. Were you able to talk to Bob or any other umpires?
I met Bob twice. I met Bob 2 or 3 times. Know his son Byron quite well, and so I've talked to Byron a lot. But Bob was really interesting person to talk to. Had lots of stories about what it was like meeting all the players, the opportunities he had to interact with them. He would tell as many stories about his umpiring as he would about his time in the military. And so he was very proud of that. And so often those stories would mix together. But mostly the couple occasions where I had a chance to sit down and talk to Bob myself, he talked about what it was like traveling and what it was like as the umpire traveling, often not alone. Sometimes he got to travel with the team, but typically he traveled alone, and the difficulties of some of that, just being on the road in this country in the time frame that he was traveling, some of the experiences that he had. But he also loved what he did. He thoroughly enjoyed the opportunities. He didn't really, the one question you always wanted to ask, you always ask umpires, who was the person that gave you the most difficulties, the most troubles? I asked him that one time just out of curiosity, and his answer was none of them. They knew better. Now, whether that was true or not, but that was sort of Bob's take on it. Bob said, I was the umpire. I was in charge. That was the way it was.
Blake, if I can make one point about that book.
Yeah.
One of the stories I enjoyed the most was Motley talking about being behind the plate, calling balls and strikes when Satchel was in his prime. And his description of Satchel reminded me of how we describe Greg Maddux.
Yes.
Put the ball where he wanted all the time.
Yeah, he sort of confirms those sort of stories that everybody's heard, Satchel being able to put a gum wrapper on the plate and being able to throw the ball right over it. And you listen to Bob Motley talking about Satchel, he would say that was true, that Satch could put the ball wherever he wanted, pretty much, particularly in those prime years. But even in some of his later years, he was still, that he could pretty much pinpoint exactly where he wanted the ball to go.
We've gone through the questions. Bill, anything to add from the research you've done? I know we just did you just finished editing the Smoketown book. Anything to add?
I had to unmute myself here. No, not really. I've been enjoying listening, but I admit that I have been listening while I've been also helping somebody else work on a bio. So I've been kind of half tuned out there.
What a shock.
Yeah, he's writing a guy named Bill Mills for our book on players that had just one hit in the major leagues. And
Oh, wow.
so,
Yes. Talk about tough research there.
yeah. But I have enjoyed the conversation. I'm very impressed, Leslie, with all the people that you had a chance to meet over all the years there. I'm envious.
It's been quite an experience. And there's many that I would have liked to meet that I never got a chance to, unfortunately. But
One story did come to mind about a time I was down at the Ted Williams Museum with Johnny Pesky, and I was working on his biography, and he was signing autographs for people after the event, and he stayed on and on and on. He felt he was from that generation, perhaps. Maybe they weren't all like that. Some of them were probably just pure alcoholics or something, but he felt obliged to stay until everybody had their autograph signed. And he said, Bill, I gotta find a men's room.
I will say that I got a chance to meet and chat with Willie Mays, and I don't know how many people have ever had, and I was pleasantly surprised because so many people have said that Mays often is not necessarily the easiest person to chat with and things like that, that he is a bit gruff with people and sometimes walks away from them. That was not my experience at all. When I met Willie, he was incredibly gracious, easy to talk to, didn't chat long, but I had no, and so that was, just met him once walking down the streets in Cooperstown. He was, because he wouldn't sit and and sign autographs and things. So he was just walking down the street, and I just walked up and introduced myself, and he stopped and chatted for quite a while with me. And he was curious, as many are, as to why I was interested in baseball as a female.
Very good. Joe, you had your hand was up.
Yeah, Leslie, I wanted to ask you, if I could, a question picking up on something you said quite a little bit ago, and I just didn't want to type it into the chat box, but you touched briefly on the MVP award and the renaming of it.
Sure.
And we had our session with Sean this week, which was very informative, very interesting, and it challenged me to get smarter, okay, which probably is not hard to do to get smarter for me. But I guess I'd be interested in all this research that you've done, very thorough, and I loved your book again. Your impression, if you had any, of Judge Landis going in, and as opposed to your impression coming out, did it change any? Your perspective, has it continued to change?
The perspective I had going in was that Judge Landis was a stern taskmaster, that he had very definite ideas about how he wanted things done, which is why the owners brought him in, that they brought him in for a very specific purpose at the time they made him commissioner. And therefore he was going to achieve that purpose in terms of bringing back respectability to the game, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I knew all of that going in. I also knew that he obviously was commissioner during the period that I was interested in looking at. And so in my view, he had to be involved in some way, shape, or form in preventing integration. What confirmed for me was doing my research that he definitely is responsible, partly responsible, right? It's not a coincidence that he is commissioner from 20 to 45, and as soon as he passes away and you put in a new commissioner, things change. Now, certainly you can also argue the context obviously changes. We're talking about World War II, the impact of World War II, all of those kinds of things. But various things that Landis did, said, wrote down, even if there was no specific absolute written rule, he made it very clear in a variety of ways his views on integration. And so if anything, my research just further solidified my belief that Landis certainly bears a significant part of, he's at the top of the chain. I mean, he could have easily made a decision and he did, and he chose not to.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems like a complex topic.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
And
Yep,
my impression
absolutely.
in reading your book is none is probably too broad. None of the owners really wanted this either because they were fearful of what would happen if.
Sure.
Monetarily, physically,
Yeah. Oh, he doesn't.
whatever.
Yep.
And he, it just seems like it's perhaps more complex topic. And again, I'm not trying to find an escape clause for him or anything.
Oh, no,
A
no.
responsibility, but
Absolutely. No, I would agree. It's definitely, and you can never say, absolute that one person is the sole, right? There's a multitude of factors that are involved. Where Landis, obviously, I think, in my opinion, takes on a more significant role in all of it, is just simply because of the role that he played. He was the commissioner, after all. And so if he had wanted to,
the
if he had
dictatorial
chosen to,
commissioner.
he could have, right? For example, he could have allowed even Negro League teams to play against the World Series winner, right? But that didn't happen. He made the decision that Major League teams couldn't play Negro League teams as intact units. So they could only, that's where you get the all-star teams and things. Those are decisions that he made. He could have made different decisions. He was the commissioner, after all.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Leslie, we're at the end of the questions. I know we've been going for a while. I really appreciate you being here today. This has just been a great discussion. I really appreciate you being here. I'm going to ask one more time. Does anybody have any parting questions? I'm holding back one question because it's not really Negro League related.
This is the closing question.
The closing question being, I heard the Miami Marlins did something yesterday, and you might have somewhat of an interest in it.
I have lots of interest in that. Yes, hopefully everybody is aware of what the Miami Marlins did yesterday in making history and naming Kim Ng their general manager, first woman to hold that position, which is long time coming, long overdue. She is incredibly well qualified for this position, and we're very excited to see this barrier take a hit at least, and hopefully open the door for others to follow. As we've seen in the last couple of years, a number of women moving into positions they have not been in before. But Kim's got a long pedigree. I mean, she started almost 30 years ago with the Chicago White Sox, Yankees, Dodgers, Major League Baseball, and now finally getting the opportunity. So I think lots of people are very excited to see this happen.
All right. Well, I wanted you to end on a real high.
Oh yeah. And if you ever get a chance to meet Kim down the road, she's an incredibly interesting person to talk to. She knows baseball in and out, and I think she's going to be fantastic.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. I'm getting some thank you notes in the chat room, and anyways, again, we really appreciate.
Well, I just appreciate all the great questions and the interest and the opportunity to come and chat with you. I always enjoy, and there were some really, really good, interesting questions, and so I really appreciate it. So thank you as well.
All right. Well, we're going to do some. Leslie, you're certainly welcome to stay online. We have a little administrative work to do here to set up the next book we're going to do, because every 3 months we call our meetings the book club, and we wrap up by talking about maybe what we'll read next. But
I
really
think I'll stay on just to
you.
hear.
Huh?
I'm going to stay on to hear some of the ideas. It might
You're
give me something to
absolutely
read.
welcome.
Okay, cool.
It's democracy
Guys,
in action.
Huh? Yeah, that's
Democracy
right.
in action here.
Democracy in action. So to recall where we went last time, I mean, obviously the theme of Negro Leagues, we're going to kick Dave out of the club. Who just said it was rigged. We picked the Negro Leagues as a theme last time. The last time we did this, Willie Mays finished second. The Federal League finished third, and Leo DeRocher finished fourth. They Bleed Blue finished fifth. Louis Tiant book finished sixth, and Rod Carew finished seventh. We usually take the top three also rans and put them into the next month's group, which would say Willie Mays, Federal League, and Leo DeRocher. I would actually suggest we not do the Federal League next, just because we've done several themes in a row, and I'd like to go back to just a single subject matter, and I guess that we could do that. I'm willing to be, talked out of that, but I've gotten some comments from some other people saying, we did announcers, we've done couple meetings in a row of themes, so maybe we should go back to a player. So that would still leave us with Willie Mays and Leo DeRocher books. Again, to recall, normally we don't allow a book unless it's available as a paperback. The one thing about the Leo DeRocher book, it still isn't available in paperback, but it's been out as a hardback so long that when you look at Amazon, you can get hardback of that book for $6-7. And the Columbus Library has 10 copies of it. So I view it as a pretty accessible book. And I mean, the reason why we were picking, making sure books were hard or paperback was for affordability for those who buy the books. But I think you can get that book just as inexpensive in hardback as not. So that's why we've included that. I throw open the floor as to, first of all, your thoughts about Willie Mays is on the list.
Is this the one you were talking about?
We had two books on the list. One was the Hirsch book, and then the one that just came out. Is that 24?
Yes.
Yeah. Those were the two. Either of those two books would be good. I mean, I know right now it'd be tempting to do that. Let me read the chat here. Other books that that people want to throw out. And do you agree with the let's skip themes for at least the next quarter? And then Leslie, what we normally do is in the COVID world, usually we go around the room and just raise hands. In the COVID world, we've been having people email their top 3 priorities and kind of grade them out with the ranking system. Any others that people would like to nominate? We got Willie Mays, DeRocher. We picking between those two?
You had the Louis Tiant book, Blake, from the last time.
All right. You want to put that back on the list again?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So is the Willie Mays a particular Willie Mays book or any Willie Mays book?
I would still say we could do any Willie Mays book. I mean, the fact is some people already own the Hirsch book, and I don't want them to have to go out and get the 24. I think either of those books, and I know there was one probably back in the 70s that was pretty good called Say Hey, that was also really it was a really good book. I mean, there's and I think the first one was probably the Arnold Hanno book. Rick, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt like Hanno's book came out in the 70s. Is that right?
That was more a book about his day at the ballpark for the famous catch in 1954.
Okay.
More than just Willie Mays, although Willie's certainly a part of it.
Yeah. So I'd say 24 or the Hirsch book are the two that we're most recommending. I've pitched him. That book's finished. He has a subject matter. He's finished second place probably for a year straight.
Just like the Giants in the 60s.
There you go. Others to consider. Willie, Dave Philippi just said Willie's Time by Epstein is another. Yeah, Dave's showing it right now. Thanks. Other comments? I know we're pushing up on our hour and a half. I appreciate it. This was such a really good one. Leslie, this really was a terrific session. I don't know if the people know, I joined her fan club years ago and I've never left. Well, then here's what I'm going to send out. I'll send out an email. I've got the Willie Mays book, the Tion book, Leo DeRocher, and what about Bleed Blue? That got some votes last time as well. The book on the '81 Dodgers.
Turbo.
Say that.
Was it Jason Turbo?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I got Dave saying, yep, let's keep that in. Other than that, so we're probably looking at, this is November, December, January, probably February is when we'll be meeting on this book. In the meantime, we'll have two talking baseball sessions. One of them's already scheduled on, I think it's December 19th. And then we'll do one in January. I know Leslie had asked that we inform people when our annual meeting and SABR Day sessions normally are. They're not so much encouraging everybody to do it on SABR Day this time, maybe spreading them out so that you can attend more. I know a number of people are doing some Wednesday nighters and then some of the weekends before and after that. I know SABR Day's always been on the weekend in between the conference championships and the Super Bowl. It's always been pretty easy to plan on, but so anyways, we'll still have a January. I mean, I think our cadence has been, at least a group of us like to talk baseball once a month. So we'll keep doing that. And we'll make sure we get some good subjects. I want to stand up just so people can see my jersey, because it kind of didn't give its due. I don't know that Bill Nowell is still on the line, but I just want to make sure the Crawfords got their due.
Nice.
I have the matching Josh Gibson jersey. I have a Grays jersey as well. So, and you know, I can wear these anywhere. You know, so a little side joke there, but anything to add? Going once.
I did want to,
Blake.
just a second on the annual meeting. We haven't given up on the idea of doing that. I just hate to do it virtually, because we usually have several speakers and we're going to have to cut it in half, you know, to do it justice. It's just going to change the whole atmosphere. So I think if we hold off a little bit longer with the vaccine promises and things like that, maybe we can still get something in when the weather warms up a little bit next year. Does anybody have any specific feelings on that? Can we wait that long, or do people want to try to cut the meeting in half and do it as a virtual?
Yeah, I think at some point it will be worth reconsidering. I agree with waiting. We have a lot of subjects we'll keep talking about, but if there's not a good plan soon, then the idea of breaking it into maybe even 3 sessions. I know, Larry, you've been sitting on your topic for, 8 months now, quite a while. I appreciate that. Fortunately, you're not going anywhere. And I think at least two of our other speakers are able to hold off as well, but there's always some risk that they'll move away or something, and not want to do it. But anyways, other comments? Thanks for bringing that up, Rick.
Right, yeah.
I hope that I don't waste anybody's time, but I have actually one question regarding still the Negro League. That question came to my mind, that if I started to read about baseball history, then I quite quickly find myself spending the time with the work by Seymour or Alan Lee, and they also mentioned the Negro League, but now if I hear all those stories and recommended books, then I actually think that the topic as a historical material for writer, it's still quite new. That's my question is, how far the written history of Negro League goes?
How far
the written history of Negro League goes?
How far back the written history? Is
Yeah.
That,
let's say that critical writing.
Sure. Well, Bob Peterson's book is generally, which 1970 is generally considered the real beginning of the significant work. There are certainly a few things before that that touch upon it. Somebody mentioned, I don't remember who it was, Revolt of the Black Athlete, that comes before that. There's Art Rust's books that came out in the late 1950, early 1960. I can't remember exactly. Get that on the unfortunate title that he had, obviously in the context of the time period, but Art Rust. And then there's a couple others that came out prior to Bob Peterson's. And then before that, in terms of books, you've got the Seymours, as you mentioned, and others that just mention it here and there, and that's what you find. And then you jump back to Saul White's book. And Saul White's piece obviously is not written by a scholar or anything, but Saul White's work is still considered to be one of the most significant pieces to help us understand the 19th century. And Saul White's book came out just after the turn of the century, but there's a big gap in there from that time period, really, until the 1960s, early 1970s. And then there's a jump from the 70s into the late 80s. So there's some significant gaps.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else? Ladies and gentlemen, I enjoyed it.
It was terrific. Thanks, Blake.
Great job,
Yep.
Blake.
Great
Thanks,
job.
Leslie.
All right.
Blake.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody, it was fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Blake.
Mary Beth, thanks for joining us. Bill, thanks for joining us.
T-shirt, Leslie.
And the normal Columbus contingent, I always appreciate you. All right.
Take care. Have a good weekend. Be safe.
Okay, bye, everybody.